This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
Hi, I'm Kevin Savitz, and this is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. Today's interviewee is Dave Small. Dave wrote the Outpost Atari column in Creative Computing magazine. He was a prolific writer about Atari stuff. He also wrote the Creative Atari book, which was also published by Creative Computing, and he wrote for Analog and PC Tech Journal and Antic and Current Notes. He worked with his wife. He was one half of Dave and Sandy Small. You saw both of their names on a lot of the articles and things. In addition, Dave was co-founder of LE Systems, which was a company that made disk duplicating hardware and the Integrator hard drive interface for the Atari 8-bit machines. And on the Atari ST side of things, he created Magic Sack and Spectre GCR, which were emulators that let you run Macintosh software on the Atari ST. He and Sandy also developed a pair of Atari computer games for Boeing to be shown at trade shows. Dave has a lot of memories and had a lot to say. Frankly, this is a slow-paced interview with lots of reminiscing. Dave tells stories about his kids and talks a lot about Atari ST stuff, and it's all great. It's not as maybe as focused on Atari 8-bit stuff as we might normally do, but this was a great interview to do, and really enjoyed talking to Dave, and I think you'll enjoy listening to our discussion. And it's a long one. It goes 2 hours and 42 minutes. The interview was conducted September 4th, 2014 over the phone. He was at his apartment in Colorado. Enjoy this interview with Dave Small.
Tell me the first time you saw, used, played with an Atari computer.
When I got out of college in 1980, I went to San Jose, California, and the people there from Control Data were their microcomputer group, and we all had Ataris. And apparently there was a contract between Atari and CDC that CDC would write some microcomputer software. Mm-hmm. But I heard a fuss in the boss's office, went in, and here's the game Star Raiders playing. And, oh man, I was entranced. So I learned a lot about that machine. I wanted to be able to write stuff like that. As it turned out, my assignment was to do a QA on statistical software.
It's like the opposite of playing Star Raiders, right?
Very much so. And it was all in Atari Basic, so it didn't exactly go fast. I'd start the program, go to lunch, come back, and see if it had completed yet. And so it went May, June, July, and so forth. And my girlfriend from college was now in Austin, Texas, working for Texas Instruments. And she came out and visited with me and mentioned that there was a job open at TI if I wanted that. And, essentially it was getting serious about a girlfriend. Mm-hmm. So I put in my 30 days notice at CDC, and she came out and we drove back together to Austin, Texas. Quite the long drive. And we moved in together and worked at TI. And, that was interesting, but the TI 99.4 was not as exciting for me. I found the whole Atari concept of driving a TV as best as it can be driven to be much more interesting.
What were you doing with the 99.4A? 99.4 or 4A?
Well, I glanced at it occasionally, but I was working in service, field service, and we were swapping out printers that TI made for a bunch of pharmacies around the East Coast. I remember that's the first time I ever heard of the town King of Prussia. And so we were swapping out printers that had reliability problems for some new ones, and that's what I did. And, during the evenings I would maybe pick up a manual and read it, or pick up Creative Computing and read that. A lot of stuff was happening.
Mm-hmm.
So Sandy became pregnant, and we were already engaged and everything. And when she took time off from TI because she was pregnant, I left TI as well. And by the time I did that, I had already had a couple of articles published. And boy, I can still remember the surprise of having them accept the articles. I mean, geez.
Well, before we get to that, so you're working at TI. You have a baby on the way, so you decide to quit your job.
Yeah, actually. TI and I really didn't get along. My job description didn't have the word programmer in it, so they wouldn't allow me to program a computer to do anything like track field service requests. And I thought that was kind of, stodgy of them.
Yeah.
But, the micros were just starting to happen, and a lot of companies were slow to pick up on that. And, I had written an article about Atari's graphics and how they worked, and sent it to my favorite magazine, which was Creative Computing.
Mm-hmm.
I expected to get a mimeographed, "Thank you for your submission. However, we don't have room for it," or whatever.
Right.
And Sandy actually took the phone call from David All, who was the publisher, saying, "We want it. We're going to run it in 2 consecutive months. And do you have any more?" Well, yes, I knew more about it. Great. Would you like to be our columnist for Atari stuff? And I said, "What? George Blank is leaving?" And they said, "Yeah, he wants to get back to the ministry, which is his real passion." And I said, "Okay, I'll give it a try."
Wow.
Now, during all of this, I didn't have an Atari computer. I mean, it makes it a little more difficult. So what I would do is drive down to this fairly cool computer store, and I would rent time on an Atari 800. I'd write the programs, check them out, make sure they worked, and then post them in Creative Computing.
Wow.
Now, at that time, Atari wanted to control all information about the computer.
Sure. So give me a year here. I'm thinking we're talking 1980 or so, but...
Let's see. I got married in 1981. That was roughly when Sandy and I left TI. So first article was May of 1981.
Okay. So how did you write that one article, the one you wrote on Spec? How did you write that without an Atari?
Well, I went and rented time on the Atari at the computer store.
For even that first article. Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Right. So you're saying at the time Atari was trying to control information about the machine?
Yeah, they wouldn't allow any info about how the custom chips worked. to be, freely distributed.
Mm-hmm.
And because of how I left CDC, I got moved from statistic analysis to Atari stuff. I had never signed a non-disclosure.
Mm-hmm.
And many people at Atari didn't like the policy of, we will pick the developers and only they will have the knowledge to program the Atari.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe, information wants to be free. That's the hacker ethic, and my mentors had taught me that. So I just told people how it worked. And after the first two articles, a guy from Siggraph in the ACM, which is Special Interest Group for Graphics, at the very spiffy Association for Computer Machinery.
Mm-hmm.
He called up and said, "We've been reading your articles. How would you like to do a presentation on the Atari in Dallas in a few months?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd enjoy that." After I hung up, I remembered that I didn't have a computer. So I FedExed a letter to Atari saying, "Help! Siggraph wants me to show your computer, and I don't have one." And to their credit, Atari shipped me a nice 800, couple disk drives, and a whole bunch of programs that showed the machine off from people who would later become fairly well known. Chris Crawford was one of them. And Chris and I are old buddies now.
So you went and did your talk?
Yeah. Boy, talk about nervous. But I settled down about 5 minutes into the talk and answered what questions I could. Some of them I didn't know the answer to. What is the horizontal scanning frequency of the Atari? Frankly, I don't know. And there were some questions like that. But a lot of these people were graphics wizards who knew that kind of stuff. And I had basically learned on a rented Atari. Came back from Dallas. That was sort of our honeymoon. And settled into writing the column and doing things for the 8-bit. And I thoroughly loved the 8-bit machine. Other people, they love the TRS-80, the Apple II. I think it's whatever machine seems interesting and exciting is the one you want to work on. And that was the Atari for me. I guess seeing Star Raider that first time really motivated me. It wasn't tedious to read the manuals. It was fun. Learning about it, trying to get it to do things, and making lots of mistakes, and learning from them. And I look back on it, and I just checked, and I think it was 33 years ago. And yet I still remember the articles and diagrams we did and how we did it and all sorts of stuff. I worked on this. I worked for a company that made computer plotters and interfaced them to the Atari, so they ran really well. And around 1984, my wife and I agreed that Colorado, where we'd come from, was drawing us. And we felt we should go there. So we did. two little kids in tow.
Before we moved to Colorado, we are still in Texas. And did you get another job after TI, or were you just freelance writing as your income, or?
I had one job, which was a plotter company.
What company was that?
I'm going blank on the name. I'll remember it in a minute.
Okay.
It has been a long time since I thought about them. What they had was a tablet and a little pen, and you could move the pen around and draw things and whatnot. The trouble is, they hooked it up using its serial port instead of its parallel port, and the serial port was very slow.
Mm-hmm.
So you had to move the mouse really, really slowly, or it would just screw up the display. So I did it with the Atari, parallel into the front ports, and it updated every 60th of a second. And all of a sudden, you could draw things out freehand. Very much like Mac Paint. We showed that at one of the West Coast computer fairs, and a guy came up who was an artist and drew a really nice picture. It was very cool.
Wow. Okay, so then you moved to Colorado.
Yeah, I was born and raised here, and Sandy had grown up in Colorado Springs. Her dad's an Air Force pilot, and he used to be the back seater in the SR-71.
Mm.
And
wow.
They were at Peterson Air Force Base, and then she came up to CSU, where we met. Colorado State is in a lovely town, Fort Collins. I could retire there happily. Oak trees, wide streets, people that are Western, kind of laid back, and nice people. Colorado State was just about the best college I'd ever seen. And I still like it. My son Eric went there, graduated. And, life is funny. The ways it turns, and so forth. I teamed up with a hardware engineer, and we were both, I'd met him at the plotter company, and we first did a EEPROM programmer that plugged into an Atari slot. And then we got more, adventurous. We decided the disk drives were very slow on the Atari, so we made one that went right onto the computer bus. That was Leading Edge Systems, which we had to change the name of because Leading Edge called us up and said, hey. So we came out with the LE Systems disk drive. It was very fast. And developers liked it because they could use double density.
Mm-hmm.
And we set it up so there could be up to 8 disk drives attached to it. And if you copied one disk onto 7 other disks, it would complete that in 18 seconds.
Wow.
Yeah.
So was this a bank of 8 drives, stacked 8 high, that then plugged into the 800s straight into the bus?
Well, 2 cables and 2 ports on top of the card that plugged into the Atari. And they had 34-pin standard PC cables for floppies. Well, they didn't have the twist in the middle, but standard 34-pin stuff. And there'd be 4 drives on each, and one of them would be the master that read the disk, and the other ones would write out whatever it said, and then it would go verify them.
Wow.
And boy, a lot of people in the industry wanted that. They needed disk copiers. And
so you
there weren't that many.
So who what companies use these, as far as you know?
This was called LE Systems. It was a startup that I was half of.
I mean, what companies bought your unit in order to do disk duplication?
Synapse Software and Broderbund are the two that I remember right off. There was a guy who put out something called Tricky Tutorials, and he had one. And that's all I can remember right off.
What did this gadget cost?
You know, I don't remember. It's only been 33 years.
I mean, give me a ballpark. I mean, was it super expensive? Was it, I mean, for what it does, it sounds like it should have been.
Well, what was funny is we were in the same building as the Dell people. And we got to know them fairly well, and they got to know us pretty well. We used standard Tandon floppy disk drives, and they would give us those at pretty much cost. I'm thinking it was around $2,000, but please don't hold me to that number.
Okay. No. All right. So, what other products for the 8-bit did LE Systems come up with?
Well, a friend of mine from the computer club, a guy named Alan Adams, terrific guy. He had a Corvus hard disk, and boy, was it incompatible with a bunch of stuff. You had to use Corvus's operating system, which was a heavily patched Atari OS. So if it was something like a game or something else that wouldn't let you boot up the computer, you couldn't get the hard disk to work. And the same was true of the Axlon 128K RAM disk. They were both incompatible. So I came up with a circuit board that you put your Atari's ROMs on, and it had one more slot for a ROM, and that's where I did my thing. And came up with a way where pretty much no matter where you were in an Atari program, you could hold down one of the option buttons, press reset if needed, and bink, up on the screen, there would be slots for 8 disk drives, D1 through D8. And your Corvus partitions could be mapped to any of those 8 drives. And I think Alan had a 20 megabyte unit, and those were way expensive, $3,000-$4,000. So we ended up making this board, and we called it the Integrator board, and sold a fair number of them. There were people out there with Corvus hard disks that really, really wanted some way to run their other programs with the Corvus. And we made a company named ADS, which was Alan, David, and Sandy, just the initials. And there are people still looking for Integrator boards. I got an email, a month ago. Do you have any left? Do you have any in your private collection? At that time, no. When I cleaned up, I found a couple.
Wow.
And, yeah, quite the cleanup. And the LE System disk drive board, I don't have one of anymore that I could find. I have one of the cards that plugged into it, but that's about it. Then I got to know the people at Software Products or something, SWP. They made the ATR 8000. And they wanted some Atari software written for them. Their serial port was so fast that it would overflow the receive buffer on the Atari. So I went and rewrote the whole driver. And it was one of those programs where the programmer feels that giving out any information might be harmful. So 0 documentation, none of the hex addresses to the chips were commented. You know, they didn't just say, you know, load A into Gractal. It was load A into DC12 the whole way through. So I tightened the code up, made for a much larger input buffer, took care of that, and they gave me an ATR 8000.
Wow.
Which was a cool machine.
Yeah, yeah.
From there I learned about CP/M and learned some 8080 assembly. Now 8080 I had known. That was my first assembly language. And I'm back in college days now. There was a system called Plato, and it was an educational computer system, and it was all on running on a Cyber 171 in Minneapolis. And both the people at CU, which is in Boulder, Colorado, and CSU, which is up in Fort Collins, we were both on Plato. And we had one terminal, and they had 8 or 9. And there was a game called Empire, which was basically Star Trek. But this was Star Trek with graphics, you know, photon torpedoes and the phasers and so forth. And it was a campaigning game with lots and lots of tactical stuff. The guys down at CU decided they would become the Klingon team, and they whooped everybody. And I was on the Federation team, the Fedi Bunnies. And I was looking at this one day, and, you know, to send out 3 groups of 3 photon torpedoes, you had to type all this stuff. And the touch typists at CU were much faster. I never learned how to touch type. So I modified things so my terminal could run Z80 programs that I wrote instead of just the Plato software. And now you could press one arrow key in the direction the bad guys are, and it would handle the rest. Sort of a key presser.
Mm-hmm.
And oh boy, we went into first place with the Fedi team. I spent a lot of time on this. And when I was cleaning up, I found the original printout of my code. And it's like, gee, I kind of still code the same. I put a lot of documentation into code. And my buddy Dan Moore says that I write a damn book in the code. And he's right, but, you know, it's a fun way to deal with that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So that was my first exposure to assembly. In high school, I was lucky enough to be in a computer club, the Jefferson County Computer Club. And many of the people there were mentors for me, especially a guy named John Ridges. And John is simply the best computer man I've ever met in both software and hardware. John and I would talk over the years, and he was the one who finally helped me debug an accelerator board, and he designed the GCR cartridge. So we've kept in touch. And it turned out John was in the business of making disk copiers.
Mm-hmm. So
we were sort of friendly rivals. He knew computers in a different way than I did. Instead of using a floppy controller chip, he used a serial chip. And, well, yeah, disk data coming off is serial, so you could read it that way, and John did it that way. That's something I never would have thought of. Serial chips, RS-232, serial interface, yes. And they did some of the first Apple II music products, cards that played melodies and so forth. They also did some articles for Creative Computing. And that's one of the places I learned that Creative Computing was the coolest magazine around. Dave All and now Betsy All really deserve credit. They got information out there. They jump-started the Atari market. A few months after I'd been writing tutorials, Atari threw in the towel, and Chris Crawford and his group put out De Re Atari,
right,
which is a superb explanation of the computer. I really enjoyed reading it. Then Chris started writing a column in Byte magazine explaining the Atari. So here's Chris and I, 1 month he's ahead, 1 month I'm ahead. It was great fun.
It seems like he would have a tactical advantage because, well, he works at Atari and he wrote De Re Atari, and he probably knew the guts.
Oh, in and out. Yeah.
Yeah, in and out. Yeah.
And he's made a lot of really revolutionary games. The smooth scrolling in the Eastern Front opened up a whole bunch of people who had been looking for something like it, but never really sat down and said, here's what I want it to do.
Right.
Chris is a genius, no question about it. He lived for a long time in the Bay Area, up on the land side, above Fremont. And his house had this spectacular view of the whole Bay Area. And he even had a telescope when he spotted something interesting in the Bay Area. And otherwise, he'd look at stars. I believe Chris is now up in Oregon. But
yes, he is. I interviewed him
in a bit.
A few months ago.
Cool. What a nice guy.
Yeah.
What
okay, so you are at LE Systems, and you're pumping out integrator boards, and you're pumping out disk drive copying units.
Yeah.
And that's all going well until what? What happened?
This is a long story. I don't know if you'll want it.
I've got time.
Oh, okay. My wife and kids and I had spent a little time in the Bay Area, especially at Synapse Software, fixing their disk drives. And whenever I'd go out there, they'd come with me and get together with people I knew and, in effect, their cousins. So, what happens? But on the flight home to Austin, which had one stop in Denver, I get the flu. Mm-hmm. And I was so sick. And the stewardesses were like, well, if you could return to your seat. No, it's okay. We've thought about it. Keep yourself in the restroom. So we got to Denver. My parents live here. And I called them up finally and said, look, help. And they came out and picked us up. And a couple days later, when I was over the flu, I stepped outside, and it was a Colorado spring rainstorm. And that's a smell everybody in Colorado knows. It's a clean, really, really great smell. And I took a whiff of that, and all of a sudden I knew where home was. And that's when Sandy and I decided to move from Austin with 2 kids up to Denver. So that's what happened. I smelled a rainstorm. It's funny how things like that work out.
Yeah. You were making the LE system stuff. That was in Colorado, right?
That was in Austin.
That was in Austin. So did you just stop it after you stopped after you moved, or did you bring the business with you?
Well, I had a unit for myself. The demand for them had dropped. This was 1984, and Atari was starting to fumble, and the market was slowing way down. We had trouble even buying some of the LS chips, some of the Jelly Bean digital chips. And finally, we found a person who was pulling them off old circuit boards, and we had to go with that. There was a national shortage of ICs. So we got up to Denver. We said goodbye to Alan and so forth, and set up shop here. During all this, I'm writing columns for Creative Computing, and Creative, those were the glory years. They had good people writing all sorts of stuff and interesting outside things. And Dave All was publishing his kind of basic games that you could key in and enjoy. Everything was new. You know, nobody could believe how fast the micros had grown. And for me, it's, well, if you make a great machine and tell people how to program it, the creative people are going to jump on it. Same thing happened with the Atari ST. Up here, let's see. I spent a little time at a disk copy protection place, and it didn't work that well. And I felt kind of queasy about doing that.
This was a firm that added copy protection or to for software houses?
Yeah.
Okay.
The competition was an outfit that said it used a laser to put a little unreadable area in a disk sector. And the thing about that is when the read-write head goes over it, it kind of mumbles. It can't decide between a 1 and a 0, so it mumbles. And every time the head goes by, it mumbles again with different patterns. So the software would check for a sector that never settled down and read correctly. And that was the copy protection. Later on, I found out that they really used a drill with a sharp bit on it, but they'd said laser because it sounded so high-tech. A lot of computer stuff is like that. Well, a lot of industry is like that.
Yeah. So that is that part of what made you uncomfortable, was that they claimed they were using lasers and in fact were using drills?
No, that was the competition.
Oh, okay.
This made me uncomfortable. It turned out the guy who had come up with it had a bad disagreement with the company. He was a relative of one of the people at the company. So he took his source code and encrypted it and said, well, you can't say I've stolen the source code because you still have it. Of course, it's encrypted and, you know.
Right.
But until you pay me, I'm not going to turn over the real code. So that was obviously deteriorating quickly. So I got out of that. And by 1985, an old friend of mine from high school and the computer club named Joel and I were getting together and chatting. Joel had been the best man at my wedding down in Texas. And he and I had done some pretty good high school pranks. Other than that, high school was very, very tedious. Cliques. And in general, the same stories that anybody else tells of high school. Programmers feel like they were picked on the most. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's true. I don't know. We went to Comdex, I think. Is it Comdex or the West Coast Fair? Comdex. And saw the new Atari computer. Mm-hmm. And little ideas were flickering in my mind, namely, what if this thing could write Macintosh software? Mm-hmm. So Joel bought me a system, and I started doing that. And I think that was fall of 85. On the 8-bit side, one of the editors, I was branching out to other magazines now. So I wrote for PC Tech Journal and for Creative Atari, for Analog. There were just a variety of fun little magazines.
I know you wrote for Antic starting in February 1983.
Was it that far back?
That's what I've got here.
I believe you. My notebooks of articles, which are 2 shelves long, is still packed up, amazingly, until I get more shelves set up here. So I can't pull it right out and tell you the precise date. But Antic was a fun magazine. Jim Capral was a great editor, and I got to know people through that. And it's amazing how many people in this industry are just the nicest people you can imagine. I've found that the really famous people are usually even nicer. I got to meet Todd Rundgren at one of these get-togethers, and Todd's a terrific guy. And we talked across breakfast, and he mentioned his interests in computers. He'd come up with something very new. Mm-hmm. It was fun. And I got to have breakfast with Jay Miner.
Wow.
The machines designer.
Mm-hmm.
He told me that any rumors I had heard about Atari and Commodore and the Amiga, he says they're all pretty much true. And regrettably, Jay was having kidney problems and got a transplant, and that didn't work out. And he will be remembered. He did some fantastic things.
Yes, he did.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. On the 8-bit, the articles. You see, I have over 500 articles published. And a French magazine for a while was grabbing my columns from Current Notes, translating them into French, and run in the magazine.
Uh-huh.
And the translator was not too swift. And all these nice people from France wrote me and emailed me saying, Dave, on your last article, you said that da-da-da-da-da. And I would say, no. What happened is the magazine borrowed my column and mistranslated it. I finally had to make a form letter. And, I don't like dealing with people on a form letter. But after every issue of that magazine came out, I would have some wonderful people saying, I think you have this number wrong. And I'd look, and I had it right, but they had it wrong.
So you're doing technical support for articles you didn't even get paid for, right?
Yeah. But it comes back to you. From what I've seen, the things you do really do come back to you. And I feel very fortunate. And I got to see the micro industry when it was just flying upwards.
Yeah.
I got to be the one in my family to teach my parents how to use email. Every family has someone that has to educate their parents.
Sure. Yeah.
Now my son is trying to get me into Twitter. I do what?
It's not going so well?
Yeah. Well put. And my son James constantly brings me up to date with popular culture. I realized that this, business of young people being the best at technology when my dad handed me a watch at Christmas and said, could you set the time on this? So I handed it to my son James, said, James, could you set the time on this? And it was one of those mystery watches with 2 buttons and no directions. About 5 minutes later, James hands it back to me. The time is set. I hand it back to Granddad, who has been watching all this. Say, got the time set. And things are changing very, very quickly nowadays. And the rate of change is increasing. I don't make any predictions even 2 years out because they'll be wrong.
Right.
There's a number of people who feel that college computer sci degrees aren't very good because you do your first 2 years and then your last 2 years, and by the time you graduate, the first 2 years are obsolete.
Right.
At Colorado State, I learned control data mainframes, mag tapes, punched cards, line printers. Okay, I still love line printers. And got out in the world, and what was happening was the micros.
Right.
So I would say to anybody, you can go to college, and when you get out is when you really start learning anything. And I still feel that way. Let's see, Antic, I think Gary Yost was there. Jack, can't quite remember on that one. I ought to be able to, but, I can't. One of their senior editors. And when the Atari 8-bit faded and the ST faded, they went to Autodesk, which is a really cool company. And Tom Hudson went there.
Right.
And Tom is another one of those much brighter than I am people. He actually understands the mathematics behind clipping, window sizing, how to draw the object, what you can layer an object with, and on and on and on. And I open up graphics books, and they begin with, in graphics, it is useful to consider parameters in a matrix. And by the end of the first page, they've already written their first line of math.
Right.
Then you flip forward 100 pages, and at the top of the page it says, which leads to and another full page of equations. And I'm thinking, I'm not smart enough to learn this.
Maybe command line is more your speed, right?
Well,
why Twitter is good. It's only tell text.
What's Twitter?
All right,
my
so
parents, my parents are, quote, on Facebook, unquote, but the truth is the children set that up for them. Right. They don't want to have anything to do with it. And I still haven't gotten through to them the difference between going to AOL and then going out on the Internet. Mm-hmm. When you can go directly out on the Internet. So, when I say, let's go to Google, first thing they pull up, America Online. Mm-hmm. And they surf the net from within AOL.
Right.
My kids get a little frustrated with me being slow, and it usually ends up pretty funny. And
did they understand that you were cutting edge, leading edge stuff? 30 years ago?
The kids?
Yeah. Do you think your kids appreciate that?
I believe that because the computer stuff we were doing was way ahead, but Mom and Dad were both working in the basement of the house.
Right.
We had an employee named Barb who answered the phone and typed in registrations and so forth. And she disliked computers in a big way. So one day, Eric, who was maybe 6 at the time, came up to the Macintosh Plus, flipped it on, got out his floppy disk, booted it up, went into Mac Paint, drew a picture, shipped it off to the laser printer, came back, shut down the Macintosh, and up the stairs he went. And Barb said, "That's it. I'm going to learn about these damned computers. A 6-year-old can learn it, so can I."
Wow.
And sure enough, Barb got a Macintosh, and then she got a Mac too.
All right, so it's 1984. You were saying that you were looking at the Mac, thinking you're looking at the ST, thinking it might be able to develop Mac software.
Yeah, it was widely considered impossible for a variety of reasons, and some of them were really good reasons. I made a list of about 20 reasons it shouldn't work, and then I went and researched them. Mm-hmm. And I kept lining through items that seemed impossible, and I kept finding ways to do them. And the last one, the ST computers have the interrupt vectors, which in other words is, where in memory do I jump when I get a byte coming in from a modem or a mouse click or whatever? Those were all located for starting at 100 in memory, hex 100, and going along for another 40 longs. And the trouble was the Macintosh used that area for global variables, and programs accessed them all the time. So, what could I do? Maybe patch the Mac programs as they came in? Well, that's a way to get old. And that was the hardest thing to figure out. I would spend nights reading exciting stuff like the Motorola MFP 68901 chip. And I was leafing through that, and I found this thing I'd ignored earlier, where you could set the beginning address of the interrupt vector table. And I still remember thinking of it. Suddenly I could move the Atari hardware vectors down to location C0 up to FF.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden the Mac was able to use those locations. And at that point I had a legal pad with a bunch of lined off items. And I told Sandy, I think I can do this. And
so this led to what, the Spectre GCR?
Yeah. First off, it was called Magic Sack.
Mm-hmm.
We added a real-time clock to it because the ST would lose its marbles time-wise. And then Joel and I just had different views on how this should go.
Mm-hmm.
I look back, and he had some good points. I had some good points. And we were both really young, and we knew what we were doing was right on the edge. There always seemed to be a possibility that Apple would come close us down.
Right. So just to clarify for people who are listening, and also I'm more of an 8-bit guy, this is Magic Sack was a gadget that was a Macintosh emulator for the ST, right?
Right, the very first one.
Okay. So did Apple come down on you?
No. It was interesting. I had dinner with a bunch of Apple people. And I said, look, I really like the Macintosh. We got one. It's about our first computer in Denver. We love it. And I think, expanding the Apple's ideas to other machines would be nice. Give you, more markets to sell to. And I'm also teaching people who have Ataris how to like a Macintosh.
Mm-hmm.
And their conclusion was something like this. His heart is in the right place. He may be misguided, but his heart is in the right place. And they did send us a letter and ask us to not use the word Mac. It was originally the Mac cartridge.
Mm-hmm.
And Apple didn't want us to use the word Mac, and that was pretty easy to fix. Okay. And, don't copy Apple ROMs. Okay, that's reasonable. Mm-hmm. That's pretty much all we ever heard from them.
Wow. So I understand that in order to use, I'm off on a tangent now because I'm only supposed to talk to you about 8-bit things, but I've always wondered this, for the Magic Sack required a couple of chips.
That's right.
From a real Mac in order to work, right? A couple of ROM chips.
Yeah.
So my question is...
Oh, go ahead.
No, they contained...
Oh, they contained the soul of the Macintosh. Its graphics, the 68,000 chip did a whole bunch of stuff in the Mac. And just in general, what did they call it? The toolbox that programmers would use to program it.
Sure. So my question is, if you needed basically to perform brain surgery on a real Mac in order to get your Atari ST Mac to work, what was the point? Why would people want to harm a perfectly good real Mac in order to have an emulated Mac?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, the situation was slightly different, and we had researched it and found this out. The Apple ROMs were available as Macintosh service parts.
Hmm.
And there's some legalisms in there I still don't understand, but they boil down to you have to sell these service parts to anybody who asks. And we thought, cool. A guy that worked for, it's either InfoWorld or one of those, had driven all the way from San Jose to Washington, D.C., and along the way we gave him a place to crash for the night.
Mm-hmm.
So I called him up and told him, this is what I've done. It boots up into Mac mode. And he says, I'd love to do an article on that. I've been looking for something that'll go front page. So he couldn't find an Atari in his town. So I ended up FedExing him my Atari, monitor, disk drive, the whole shebang.
Wow.
And he took a lovely picture of Mac Paint running on Atari monitor and announced the news. And as a favor, he said, Dave will be showing this next week at the West Coast Computer Fair.
Mm-hmm.
So, sure enough, who comes in the doors first? Apple lawyers. And they don't talk like regular people talk. Where did you obtain these ROM chips? Is how they said it.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, my partner's Mac is sitting in Denver without any ROM chips in it. And apparently nobody had told them that we were not copying chips. And they, I must have taken that cartridge out 50 times and opened it. There's 2 copyright Apple chips. And one of them stayed watching us for the whole show, 2 or 3 days. But we were just showing off what it does. Then, it was really cool. 2 of the Macintosh developers stopped by.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, oh, neat. And, moved the mouse around and tapped on the keyboard. And they said, why do you have the mouse pinned to the upper left corner? It doesn't go all the way right or all the way down. And I said, well, it's because I haven't written the mouse code yet for that particular thing. And I said, what bugs me is something is going on at location 6, and it's crashing the computer. Somebody's trying to write something to location 6.
Mm-hmm.
One of them said, well, that one's my fault. I made a mistake on that, and the chips went to be mass duplicated. So we had to add a patch to the Apple code to fix where I accidentally stored in location 6. And I was like, oh. And then he'd done stuff like pop the stack and then put the stack back down, which is a big time instruction in terms of accessing memory.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm really curious. He says, well, we initialized the SCC chip, and it takes 2 microseconds to settle after it's initialized. So that was the best way I could find to waste a little bit of time with very little code. That was Andy Hertzfeld. Since then, we've stayed friends. When I go out to the Bay Area, we go out for ice cream. And he's still doing interesting stuff. Andy's a hell of a good programmer and a great person. I truly enjoyed how much he enjoyed what I'd done. Bill Atkinson I got to read or meet later, and Bill was the guy who did all the Macintosh graphics, their quick draw engine. And I told him, you know, Bill, I didn't have to change one thing in all of your code. I'm impressed. He said, oh, you know, that's just the way I wrote it. Bill's another one of those super genius people that makes me feel kind of slow. Oh, my.
A lot of what you wrote, it wasn't just you. It wasn't Dave Small. I mean, it seemed like you were working very closely with your wife, Sandy. I mean, many of the articles are by Dave and Sandy Small.
Very much, yeah.
So you guys were just like holed up in the basement writing articles together? How did that work?
Sandy's a better, I'd call it a classical programmer than I am. And she's the one who survived differential equations, which I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
But she was interested in things like developing a game and working out how to put terrain-looking things on the computer.
Mm-hmm.
And as the Mac thing grew and grew, she found herself as president of the company. And I think some of the stuff she had to do was really boring. I mean, somebody has to make sure the circuit boards, you know, leave that manufacturer and then get over to this manufacturer with all the chips necessary for them to solder it in, and on and on and on. And I had to focus very hard to get this thing to work. So we kind of made a division between us that I would handle the Mac emulation software and she would handle the hardware and the marketing. And I think after a while that got kind of old.
Yeah.
Especially, you know, the first signs of the Mac emulator, and people kind of stormed our booth. You know, we want to see this. But she wrote articles. She did some game reviews. The Axelon 128, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Just different tastes.
Sure.
Much later, I found out about personality types and computers. And we got run through that. And Sandy came out as a type that is usually a scientist or computer engineer, architect. Stuff where you have to hold a structure in your mind. And mine came out as a writer. And I couldn't have been more surprised. But as I looked through the description, it was like the person who wrote it knew me. Sandy's comment was closer, I think. She said, "So, you're really not trying to drive me crazy with your writing stuff." Yeah, I like writing. So, you know, that made for an interesting relationship. When Sandy asks you what time it is, tell her the time to the minute. Don't say, oh, it's around 10. No, what time is it? I probably drove her nuts, and she drove me nuts, but when you're working in the basement with the same person, and later persons, and going up the stairs, you can't put it behind you.
Yeah.
The little things, and those build up, and that can be a problem. I wouldn't recommend that to anybody.
So and tell me if you don't want me to, if you don't want to go here, but you were married for 15 years and then
yeah,
you were done, right? Got divorced.
We were completely burned out, is what happened. I mean, the company had died, and I think we were both just basically exhausted.
Yeah.
So we decided to split up.
Mm-hmm.
I decided that I'd really had enough of fixing disposals and the sprinkler system and the covenant committee people who wanted something done. So I'm lazy. I moved into an apartment. Now when the garbage disposal jams, I just pick the phone up.
Right.
Such a deal. The kids, people remember us bringing the two very small kids into Atari headquarters. What, 1196 Borregas?
Mm-hmm.
And
these are you brought your kids in?
Yeah.
Okay.
And here's one kid who's in kind of a child carrier. So we talked with the security people that we knew, and just for fun, we pinned visitor passes on the two kids. Everybody who saw that laughed.
Awesome.
First time I went there, it was Chris Crawford's building. He was the only person in it. And after that, it became the Trammell's building.
So why were you there? I mean, you never worked for Atari. What were you doing there?
I always tried to say hello when I was in the valley, because there were people there that I just plain liked, and with some of them we're still friends. I could probably rattle off a list of names, but I would routinely prank them, and they would routinely prank me, and it made the day go by easier. The guy that I hassled the most was Ken Battersher.
Mm-hmm.
Ken's a great programmer, and I started sending faxes. And this was when faxes were not on plain paper. They were on, heat-sensitive rolls.
Right.
And all of the faxes were from, what was her name? Sybil Shepherd, who was on Moonlighting then.
Right.
So I'd start these faxes with, Ken, I'm lost without you. It was just a physical thing. He didn't mean anything to me. Take me back, please. And then I would switch to a magic marker to write with, Ken, please, I want you, I need you. And the fax would be about 10 pages long. And Ken was at one end of the building, and their fax machine was at the other end of the building. So it would travel slowly towards him, and he'd always know when one of my faxes was on the way.
Traveling slowly as everyone in the office read it and passed it down? Yeah.
Yep. We gave Ken a Spectre GCR just to be nice, and John Townsend was like, why do you always get stuff from them? And Ken says, look at the box there, John. And inside was another Spectre GCR addressed to John.
Aww.
Yeah.
Right.
You do nice and kind things whenever you can. And usually it finds its way back to you. A lot of people helped me on the Mac emulator. And some of them were mentors, the guys that made the ATR 8000.
Mm-hmm.
I've been really fortunate. I got to see a whole new industry start up. I got to be possibly one of the last people that does a single programming feat. and sells it. And there aren't too many one-person shops around anymore.
No.
And the market has changed. And now it isn't, this is the first time anybody has ever emulated a Mac. Now it's, which Macintosh do you want to emulate with your PC?
Right. And which emulator do you want to use? And yeah,
the Hackintosh or, company around Las Vegas did a wonderful Mac 2 color emulator for the Amiga. And I've gotten to know these guys, and they've come up and given me demos of stuff, and it's been so interesting. I remember I did a short stint at IBM. They wanted me to maintain their Macintosh printer drivers. And I remember thinking, as I was in there another day, kind of twiddling my fingers, Dave, there's a lot of people who could maintain Mac printer drivers, but there's only you that can invent stuff. What person do you want to be? And I thought, Then the manager called all of us in for a meeting. And this would be 1996. And he said, hey, this World Wide Web thing is really starting to happen. And we all glanced at each other, and I thought, the man is a reverse visionary. So I raised my hand. Oh, and he said, we want you to put our printer drivers on the internet. And he's saying the words like he's never said them before.
Right.
So I held up my hand. Yes, Dave. What is the name of our website? We're at IBM. Okay. My instantaneous guess would be IBM.com.
Right.
My manager didn't know it. And he said, finally, I'll have to get back to you on that one, Dave. And a friend of mine in that meeting said, my mistake was I flinched. Could not believe what I was hearing. IBM's a strange company. Every night they would shut down all the laser writers. And the next morning they'd turn them all back on, and they would all have a different address because it's assigned sort of in the order they wake up.
Mm-hmm.
So I would send about 20 or so pages to the 20 laser writers who were fairly close to me. And I would go find out for that day what address a laser writer was.
Jeez.
And, again, it was, I could be doing something else.
Right.
And something else looked better and better.
So what did that something else turn out to be?
Well, first, taking some time off to just recover, because gadgets had been one wild ride.
Sure.
I mean, it's...
Gadgets by Small was the company that made the Antic and the Spectre GCR, right?
It's a little more complex than that. The original Mac emulator was from a place called Data Pacific.
Okay.
And that was simply Joel's company. And then we did the Mac Sac Plus.
Mm-hmm.
Then I told Joel, look, I am burned out. I need a break. And I was. Then people on Genie Network, remember Genie?
Sure.
Started saying, well, Dave, you've done the original Macintosh ROMs, the 64K of them. how's about you do the 128K ones? And I'm like, oh, God. You know, when I disassembled the Mac ROMs, the printout was 3 inches high.
Yeah.
And I had to go through it, find all the hardware addresses, and it was really tedious and hard. And finally, they threw a conference, should David do the Mac Plus ROMs? 50 people show up. They're all saying, yeah, we'd like to run HyperCard and, you know, the latest cut of Microsoft Word and stuff, and Excel, and they only run on the new ROMs. So I talked about it with my wife and said, you know, this means I'm going to be working at night because I'll be concentrating so hard that I can't have one of the kids come up to me and interrupt me.
Mm-hmm.
She says, yeah. Well, I'll watch them during the day and get them to daycare and school and so forth. And it turned out the 128s were a little easier, longer but easier, because I'd already learned so much about the Macintosh. Steve Jobs was not really happy with me. A friend of mine was in the office when his Info World arrived, and there's, you know, Dave Small does Spectre or Magic Sack. Steve was saying things like, he's stolen the family jewels, the ROMs.
Yeah.
If Steve really wanted to, you know, stop things, all he needed to do was offer to hire me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, easy approach. Here's a fully trained Mac programmer when his own people weren't doing so well on Mac programming. But Steve is not that way. And he's a marvelously complex guy. And I'm sorry he's gone. There are many, many, many legends about Steve. And, you know, they're fun to listen to. I don't know that they're true.
Yeah.
But they're stories. Well, let's
Speaking
see.
of stories, you told me to ask you about the buttons that said, I met Sandy Small.
Oh, yes. Well, we'd been writing articles with David and Sandy Small, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I was the guy going to the computer shows and that people met. And it occurred to me that while I knew a lot of people in the users groups, none of them had ever met Sandy. So I put in a order for buttons to, you know, wear on your coat that said, I met Sandy Small.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people probably said, what on earth? But it was fun, so we did it. Then we got invited to this big European show. One was called C-Bit, and it ran for 10 days. And you could drop Comdex into C-Bit and never find it again. It's huge. So I asked my French my German distributor, what a translation of I Met Sandy Small would be.
Mm-hmm.
So he rattled it off to me, and I wrote it down. And there was just something in the tone of his voice that bothered me.
Mm-hmm.
So I called the German embassy and asked if they could check this out. And I faxed it over, and the lady started kind of chuckling. And she says, well, as it's written here, there's sort of a sense of intimacy. And I said, you mean 500 guys are going to walk around at the C-Bit show with buttons saying, I slept with Sandy Small. So we got that fixed. Oh, boy. The shows were always wild.
Yeah, I bet.
I took a Tesla coil to a show, and I would ask somebody, could you hang on to this for a minute? Hand them a fluorescent light. And with my foot, I'd turn the Tesla coil on, and this light would light up just in their hands. And I had it in an outside case. In case somebody dropped it, it wouldn't shatter.
Mm-hmm.
And I handed out neon lights, little NE2 Radio Shack type neon lights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Whenever the Tesla coil was on, they glowed bright orange. And that was just fun. At the shows, everybody, the competition, everybody is trying to make it through the show. I learned not to try to talk over the PA system because you'll end up hoarse if you do that.
Mm-hmm.
Once an entire aisle power failed, so I borrowed a couple of extension cords and plugged it into my aisle. Somewhere there was a circuit breaker that had tripped. Nobody knew where it was or had a key to it. But it was good enough to make it through.
Right.
John Eidsvug from Coathead, his wife would watch me being besieged by people. And she would occasionally go get a sandwich and throw it to me for lunch. Mm-hmm. The thing about lunch was, why is it people ask you questions as you're eating?
Right.
Hey, Dave, can you tell me what 040 processor this will work with? They never seemed to get it. 95% of the people were wonderful. 5%, I kind of wondered what they did as a day job.
Yeah.
And I always thought it would be nice to just attend one of these Atari shows anonymously so I could get out of the booth and see all the cool stuff.
Yeah.
Darla Hudson back then was head of the Genie Atari area. And she and I were just having lunch. Guy sat down. I kept eating my hot dog. And he said hello, and we said hello. And he said, what do you think of this David Small guy? Do you think he's for real? And Darla's eyes were twinkling. And I said, oh, I've known David for a while. And I think he's pretty sincere. What do you think, Darla? Yeah, sometimes he might be a little high-strung, but the stuff he makes works, and I've bought some of it myself. Yeah, I think he's okay. And eventually the guy left, and Darla and I just started laughing. Here we thought we would have a little time away from our booths. The booth came to us.
It's hilarious. You'd also mentioned something when we chatted that Willie Brown at Supra was talking at you about your problems with your one of your board designs.
Willie Brown was one of the engineers at Supra that back then made hard disks and modems and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And Willie was their assembler genius who would take these modem chipsets and make them go in the firmware. And he called up one day and told me that he had been diagnosed as having leukemia, and of a very bad kind. And so Sandy and I went around and gathered up all the VHS tapes we had, stuff like Star Wars, and sent them FedEx up to his hospital so he would have something to see, because hospital TV is really dull. Yeah. However, rewind about 5 years. I was at a show, working the show, and this was the Glendale show where we first sold our Mac emulator. And 200 people had come. The instant the doors opened, whomp, we were flooded. And we sold out in about an hour. Wow. I was such an experienced businessman that I hadn't brought a box for change. Live and learn. I told people that would hand me money, I can't make change for this. I don't care. Give me one of your cartridges. So Willie was in my booth, kind of looking around, seeing if I have a spare cartridge. We got to talking. He said, I had one of your LE Systems disk drives. And the thing is, you did it all wrong. Yeah, thank you for that. How so? Well, it sprays radio interference all over the place. It's clocked at the frequency that TVs use for color burst. And if you try to use it around the TV will kind of flip upside down and completely spaz out. You said you should have done it through the front ports. I said, front ports? It says, yeah, they have RF filters on them. The way you are right now, you couldn't get this past the FCC. Front ports, I thought. And that planted the idea in my head that I should use the front ports for other things, like connecting up a plotter.
Meaning the joystick ports?
Yes.
Okay. So you connected your plotter through the front ports?
Yeah, in parallel, in effect, for the very fast plotter code. And so John, who is president of Supra, buttonholes Willie. I saw you arguing with David Small. Well, we weren't really arguing. No, you don't do that to David Small. You don't argue with David Small. Agree with him. So about 6 months later, we're at lunch with a few of the really cool people, Dan Moore and Willie and so forth, and he tells me this story, and I started laughing, and I actually had some Diet Pepsi go into my nose. Oh, Willie, you mustn't talk to John that way. Oh, boy. He was a great guy. He even loved four-wheel driving, him and me both. And, it hurts to lose somebody like that. But I remember him very fondly. The hospital asked if they could hang on to the VHS tapes. And we said, sure. I mean, they'll do some good. Let's do that. Yeah. I think they've probably given up on them by now. This was
hopefully
some time ago. And I almost went to work for Supra. They were really cool people. And there's just something about getting together a group of very competent, very kind people that don't have trouble working with each other. And when that happens, kind of a spark flares up, and serious work gets done that way. Now, submit your request to the budget people. We'll see if we can afford to prototype your idea. I've found that modern American industry does not like a stream of inventions. They're not set up to handle it. And at the plotter place I was working, I was doing that pad, I was doing color drawing, you name it.
Mm-hmm.
And that made the people in the R&D department look bad. And they expressed to me that perhaps I should leave their ranks. So I did.
Wow. But
it wasn't as much fun, and the management had kind of stratified.
Yeah.
A smaller company can always react faster than a big company. Once you reach a certain size, you have to have people managers, and they tend to not like to manage programmers. When you're a manager and you don't really understand computers, and you look at some guy in a cubicle, and he's staring at the monitor, and staring, and every now and then he presses a key, you think, this is the most lazy person I've ever seen. Look at him. He's just sitting there thinking. I had one manager tell me that he could find plenty of people who can throw code. Throw code? I mean, get a life, fella. We don't throw code, we put it down one line at a time.
Yeah.
I kind of drifted off the Atari 8-bit there. Sorry about that.
Okay, all right. I would like to talk about the Creative Atari, the book that you and Sandy and George Blank wrote for Creative Computing.
Yeah, it was a collection of the articles.
Yeah. I don't know. Actually, I don't have a question other than great book. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I worked really hard to explain things in plain language. And that's harder than it looks.
Sure.
When I was first starting on the Atari stuff, I decided the only way to explain the computer was to tell people how a TV worked.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Atari's hardware was all there to push a TV.
Right.
I continued that when I was writing manuals, and they're also written very, very plain language. On the 8-bit, golly, I was so busy giving information away that I didn't do a lot of programming for a while. Then I learned assembly language, and it's way faster than Atari Basic.
Sure.
And I thought, speed. I think I want this. So I started doing stuff on assembly language and the Atari 800. And it was so much fun. We had Boeing come to us and say, could you write a game, put it on a cartridge? We want to have a aviation game at this big trade show coming up. And Boeing had the tilt rotor aircraft and their Chinook helicopter, and they wanted one game for each.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, okay, when is this show? And they said, in 6 weeks. And I looked at Sandy, and she looked at me, and I said, normal game development time is 6 months to a year. No, they didn't know that. They just wanted to know if we'd give it a shot. Okay. And Sandy really shined in that. She did the terrain maps, and we had a helicopter game and a tilt rotor game. And that was the first time anybody used a computer game at a trade show for Boeing.
Wow.
And
now, was that game ever made available outside of Boeing at the trade show?
Boeing finally donated the cartridges to the Franklin Institute. And they thanked me for them and sent me a couple of tickets if I happened to be in Philadelphia. And another group of nice people. What I remember the most was the day before the game was due. And I had invented bank switch cartridges because the terrain map wouldn't fit into one chip. And so I had to bank switch in. So there I am, hammering along at about 11 p.m., and whoomp, we take a power hit, and the Atari just died. And I looked in it later, and the center of several chips had blown upwards. They looked like little mini volcanoes. God, our job isn't done and the frickin' show is tomorrow. So I called up a guy, Dave Mann, who was the head of the user group, and shamelessly begged him to loan me an Atari 800. And he did. What a nice guy.
Wow.
And we got the things done and the cartridges working, and I figured enough had gone wrong that I just wasn't going to take any chances. So I took the cartridges, in hand, hopped on an airplane for Washington, handed them to the Boeing guy at the end of the jet port, the thing that swings out and attaches to the aircraft. And he said, "Wow, you look like you need some sleep." And I said, "All true, all true." Then I turned right around, got back on the plane, and it took me back to Texas. We wrote that one up for, I believe it was Antic. Called it the November
I believe
Nightmare.
it was a series called Nightmare Mission.
Yeah, which it was. I mean, if I knew what I knew now, I never would have said yes. There were so many ways for it to fail.
Yeah.
But it worked.
Wow. I want to talk to you about another article that you wrote. I was looking over some of the stuff that you wrote in Antic and Creative Computing, and you wrote, I have a problem with this one. Creative Computing, July 1984, you wrote an article called The 1450 XLD is Not Dead, and you go on to explain why, even though it has been canceled, it wasn't going to get canceled because it had folks at Atari who were going to see it through. And you got my hopes up, sir, back in the day. That machine never came out.
Me too. See, I'd been at Atari at one of the developer meetings, one of the meetings with the crew that was doing the 1450. One of the people was one of my mentors from Plato, and I knew he would not be involved in something tacky. And at the meeting, I learned where the 1450 was. They were down to, should we add one analog chip or not? Because if they did, then the machine could sing. And I thought that was way cool.
Yeah.
And they showed it to me, and it was way cool. And I did the column, and a few weeks after that, it was canceled. And everybody I knew in the Atari world said, no! I mean, from my perspective, it had a really fast disk drive. Finally, Atari makes a fast disk drive. But very cool.
Yeah.
I run into people every now and then that have maybe a circuit board or a complete unit, and I have no idea how they got them. That was when Atari was fading in about 84.
Yeah.
And they were laying off people right and left. And lab equipment, like oscilloscopes, had this way of walking out the door.
Mm-hmm.
So security was checking everybody. And I had brought along something that I'd done. And the guard wanted to know, where'd I get this? I made it. So my mentor had to come out to security and, walk me through. And I've probably forgotten a whole bunch of people that helped me through all this. Mark Booth, Norm down in Texas. These guys became my beta testers.
Mm-hmm.
And I did horrible things to my beta testers. Once I made yet another mistake and sent a version out to them, and any disk it wrote became unreadable. And, these were really good beta testers, and they tested everything. I was getting ready to ship version 3, which had gone to 18 beta test revisions.
Version 3 of what?
Oh, this would be the Spectre cartridge.
Mm-hmm.
Norm calls me up on the home phone, which only he and the beta testers have. And he said, Dave, I hate to tell you this, you just broke Microsoft Word. And I said, oh. Sandy, call up the disk duplicating house and tell them to stop. We're going to have to redo the disks. And I eventually found the bug and fixed it, and 3.0 went out into the world. But boy, the beta testers were frazzled.
Do you still own an Atari 8-bit machine?
Oh, it's sitting on top of the shelves in my office.
Which one? What model?
Is it the 600? I'm afraid to go walk over to there because the phone is a radio phone and it doesn't have much range. I think it's a 600, but my brain
XL, maybe?
That could be. I've been cleaning up here for several days and looked at a whole bunch of stuff, and that kind of tends to take up memory. And I think other things have to fall out of memory first. It's such a great machine. I taught this kid who was into graphics how a TV worked by using that machine because it makes such a clean TV signal. And you can put it right on the oscilloscope and say, okay, this is what a red color does. And a little line appears and turns black, line disappears. He's like, this is really kind of easy. Yeah. On the other hand, my son learned about raster scan and has not been interested in computers since. Such interesting things happen. My daughter came and plucked the Apple Macintosh, Mac Paint, and Mac Write master disk, took it upstairs, made a sandwich out of it, and put mayonnaise on both sides of the disk. And I said to Sandy, well, no problem. These discs have, steel plate that protects them. No, Jennifer was so smart, she'd opened up the steel plate and put mayonnaise there, too. So about 1,000 Q-tips later, we tried the disc out, and that disc drive always sounded kind of funny after that. And
well lubricated.
Kind of an odd smell to the computer. She, of course, would deny everything. But, oh, boy. The kids figured out how to get into the basement, even though we locked it, in about 12 seconds. And I got a fax back from a distributor saying, "Do you know your fax machine is crudded up?" No. "Here, I'll send you back what you sent me. And it's got all these vertical lines in it."
Mm-hmm.
So I went and looked at the fax machine carefully, and there it was, cat fur. Then I notice in the trash can, there's about 95 new pages out of the copier, and they're pages of the underside of a cat. And I'm trying to think, how much Pyewacket the cat enjoyed being put on a copier and then a real bright light going underneath her.
Your kids invented the CAT scan.
Oh, 2 points. That's wonderful. I will have to pass that on. Oh, that's funny. Yeah, and sometimes they would bring the cat and our dog downstairs, release the cat and the dog simultaneously, and the cat would be going in a circle in the office, trying to get higher and higher on the shelves. The dog would be chasing the cat, and the whole office could get reduced to tatters. All sorts of stuff on the floor. "Eric and Jennifer, have you been playing with the dog and cat?" And, it wasn't mean. The dog,
right,
if you ever caught the cat, would have just licked it to death. But, man, then a guy called me up and said, "You know what happened to me?" "What?" "Well, I called your office number. Admittedly, it was, out of office hours. And this voice answered me. And it said, 'Hello.' And he said, 'Hi, I'm interested in, the Spectre GCR.' And the little voice said, 'Did you know that dinosaur means terrible lizard?'" And the guy actually is a school teacher. He figured out real fast what had happened.
Mm-hmm.
And he asked if he could talk to my mom or dad, to the kids. And he says, "No, silly, you're talking to me." Never a dull moment with kids. I came home one day to find that Jennifer now had a cast on her arm.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "What happened?" This was the first I knew of it. She said, "Oh, I was chasing some boys, and I fell down and broke my arm." Total explanation. That's all I got.
That's all you need to know.
Yeah, the very terse, brief version. So Eric comes in, and he says, "Oh, it was so cool today. Jennifer fell down and broke her arm, and there was a fire truck, and there were paramedics, and they took her in the ambulance. It was so cool." And later, when we were shipping Spectre, Eric broke his leg.
Uh-huh.
And so they put a rod in. It was a thigh muscle or thigh bone break. So they put a rod in that slides into both ends of the bone and lines them up. And Eric had been, just okay at school.
Mm-hmm.
And several people knew he'd broken his leg, and he was kind of dragging around. During the summer, he healed up. Kids heal up from anything. The doctor pulled the rod out, and Eric went to school taking the rod with him and saying, "This is what was in my leg," to the girls, who all said, "Oh, yuck!"
That's how you impress a young woman. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when you're a boy that age, that's what you do. He now has the rod in his apartment framed. He's really into the, kind of in-person Dungeons and Dragons stuff, the Society for Creative Anachronism.
Sure.
And now he helps manage the get-togethers. And they get together with 50-odd people, and bow and arrow, magical weapons, spells. They just have a ball. Jennifer came to me. I had just gotten a new computer from an obscure Chinese company, and it ran Unix. In fact, it ran AT&T and BSD Unix, depending on which tape you put into its drive.
Okay.
She said, "Can you do anything with this computer?" "Very much, I don't approve of this computer." "Sure, we'll try ray tracing." So I had Jennifer design a snowman, a red, green, and white snowman.
Mm-hmm.
And I type in a ray tracer program and eventually get it to work. And it does nothing. The printout, the screen shows an absolute black page. And Jennifer says, where's the snowman? And I said, well, it turned out the viewing spot turned out to be behind a wall, so it got no light whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
So I fixed that. Next time it ran for 46 hours and the system crashed. And it hadn't drawn any of the picture. And I'm like, what on earth? And then I realized I had surrounded the snowman with mirrors, all 6 ways. So you get that, a mirror-on-mirror effect of things multiplied.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it showed me about almost nothing of that. And then it occurred to me, Dave, you oh so smart person, the mirrors are all set to 100% reflection. What this machine did was trace a ray of light back and forth until it ran out of system stack, and then it crashed. So I turned it to 95%, and I got a picture of about a third of the snowman cut at a weird diagonal. Off to check the coordinates. Yep, got the X coordinate wrong there. By now, Jennifer is going, boy, that sure is an exciting computer. A little terse with me.
Mm-hmm.
Finally got it to do it. And here's this forest of snowmen, all reflecting great eyes, and Jennifer goes, ooh! And I'm thinking to myself, I am good. I am a proud parent.
All that work to elicit an ooh.
Yeah, and dads don't get a lot of oohs out of their kids.
Right.
In fact, as they get older, it's more like silence or don't have time to talk now, or I'm going out on a date, or, But I'd tell anybody that if they want their life to be truly interesting, have some kids. Oh, good times, good times.
I have a question for you.
Go for it.
If you could send a message to the Atari computer users that are still out there, and you can right now, what would you tell them? What would you tell them?
Let me think for a second here. I believe very much that individual programmers can still create unexpected and incredible things that are out there waiting to be discovered and done. An example of those would be the demos, starting with the bouncing ball and on up. There's something about giving a creative person kind of a sandbox to play in, and they build the damnedest things. I'm playing a game right now, and naturally its name isn't right in front of me, where you get put down in sort of an 8-bit looking place and you go mining. Oh, Minecraft.
Mm-hmm.
And people have done amazing things in Minecraft, some not related to mines at all. People have built dams and, oh golly, they put the Starship Enterprise in one game, and on and on and on. I mean, one game to go download is Minecraft. And this was just giving other people tools that they can build with. I think the Atari 800 and the other J-Miner machines is immortal. It's still the best way of driving a television that I know. Now, sure, things have gone to HD and raster scan is all changed and whatnot. But that doesn't change much. The Atari now has all sorts of tools available for it. And those are creative tools. If you learn Atari assembly language, you'll pretty much be able to pick up an assembly language for another computer. Because all the tough stuff is learning what machine code is really about.
Mm-hmm.
The people that are doing the 800 and such now, the 400, the 1200, almost the 14, they love the machine. And that's why they're doing what they do. Out of Germany and out of England have come these amazing demonstrations of stuff that I would have said was impossible. But I got to be careful saying things are impossible. I think that the first step toward somebody inventing something new is for kind of a graybeard type saying, oh, that's impossible. Boy, when I hear that, I'm like, yeah? Let's check this out.
Right. Let's get a legal pad and make a list of 20 reasons this is impossible and start crossing them out, right?
Yeah. And I should really tell you the Neil Young story. I mean, it's possibly the best story. I was programming the first Mac emulator, and I got stuck. The Macintosh handles mouse movement and keyboard movement through its central processor. The Atari uses a processor in the keyboard that chats with the 68,000 from time to time. And I didn't know how the hell to do this. So I did all the things that I do when I should be programming. I did the dishes, mowed the lawn, picked up the place, vacuumed. I finally sat down in the living room going, I have no idea how to do this. So there's that phrase around skiers, it's a double black diamond run.
Right.
And they say, no pain, no gain. So I was toying with that phrase in my head, and I inverted both sides like an equation to, if there's pain, there will be gain. I started looking through my record collection for true pain, and I found it. Neil Young, live. This was his Rust Never Sleeps tour. And you go to side 3, it was a double record.
Mm-hmm.
And here are upbeat, charming titles like The Needle and the Damage Done, about a guy who overdoses.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually 2 overdoses on that album. And Cortez massacring the Mayans, and we've got Mother Nature on the run in the 1970s. Upbeat songs, really just. And how rust never sleeps, and it's better to burn out than to fade away. And I said, aha! Went downstairs with the record player and that record, put it on side 3, the most depressing side, and put it on repeat. These days I have him on CD because I barely have a record player left. Went downstairs at about 9 p.m. with a big thing of coffee and wrote the keyboard handler. And just for fun, the mouse is always spewing out data that just means the table vibrated. And
right.
I didn't want that to happen when I was working on the keyboard. So I did, okay, we'll just take X and Y and plonk them where Apple plonks them, and I'll worry about it later. 3 a.m. rolls along, and I'm done with the code. Well, for the first pass anyway. I mean, It was 1,200 lines of code. And I was kind of dreading typing assemble, AS68-L, because the assembler was so flaky. And I also knew now I had all the really tough bugs to figure out. So I typed assemble, and it just came back to me with a C:\prompt.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, oh no, the assembler has destroyed my source code again. But I look, and here's an object file, a machine code file.
Mm-hmm.
And there had been no typos or mistakes in 1,200 lines. And I was really stunned. So I linked it with the rest of the Macintosh stuff.
Mm-hmm.
System booted up. I pulled down keycaps, and I had to do all that manually. And the keycaps worked.
Wow.
And caps lock worked, and that one was tricky. And I'm just, this doesn't happen. Well, so I get ready to debug the mouse, which I'm dreading. I push all the stuff that's collected around me as the evening wore on to the side. And while I'm pushing it, I see a flicker on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the mouse pointer, and it's moving. I reach down to the mouse, move it in a circle, and the pointer on monitor moves in a circle. And the button clicks worked. And I went running upstairs. Sandy, you've got to see this. She's deep asleep, okay? She's way asleep. Yeah. Come on. She kind of goes downstairs. Okay, what is it?
And you say you're divorced now, huh?
Well, yes,
Sorry.
And I say, it's going to work. Look. And I move the mouse around, and I pull menus up and down, and I type something. And she gives me the strangest look. Mm-hmm. And she says, well, David, that's supposed to happen that way. And I think, Sandy's brain still asleep. Took her back upstairs, went back to sleep. I found one bug total in the code. Apple's documentation about their key codes was wrong in one place. And I have been terrified to touch that code ever since. Nobody I know has ever done 1,000 lines of code without a typo. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
It happened to me this once, and I still... I think that's my right stuff moment. That's the Chuck Yeager moment.
Right.
Incredible. Gee, if I had to sum up, don't believe things are impossible just because someone said so. Leave yourself open for possibilities to work out for you. Little leap of faith. Man, when I was doing Spectre GCR and teaching the computer to read and write Macintosh format floppies, which back then were variable speed, they ran at different speeds. And teaching the Atari to talk to that with standard speed drives, boy, that was another summer down the drain. Other people take vacations during the summer. We watched Dad programming. Actually, whenever there was a World of Atari show at Anaheim, we'd go take the kids, go to Disneyland.
Mm-hmm.
The kids have been to Disneyland so much they never want to see it again. And we've only gone through the It's a Small World ride once.
Wow. That's enough.
After that. It was good times.
Yeah.
The Spectre, I got to work with some truly brilliant people. And they made me look so good. And I'm like, Dan Moore was the one that rolled it all together into a nice menu-driven interface. Doug Wheeler did all the 68030 stuff, pretty much. And the beta testers, I put their names on the back of the Spectre 128 package because I was so grateful to them. So they could go to a computer store with their friends and say, look, that's me. What fun. Dan Moore is one of the best programmers I'll ever meet. AT&T hired him, and he didn't have a college degree. He was just so competent, and they needed somebody competent, that they hired him and made a special clearance for him. Doug Wheeler, I think, is up in Minnesota. Last I heard, he was working with the Minnesota Educational Computer something, MECC.
Mm-hmm.
He's married now, has kids. I see him on Facebook from time to time. I wave hello. Chris Crawford, was very good to me when I was just starting out. Fred Thorlin at Atari, Richard Frick at Atari, who made the Mac emulator better, and the documentation from Atari was pretty limited back then.
Mm-hmm.
And Richard gave me some of the documentation that existed in-house because I needed it badly. And he gets a lot of credit, too. Leonard Trammell did not like the Mac emulator when he saw it, but it was because he wanted programmers interested in the ST, not in the Macintosh.
Sure,
And
I can see that.
I understood. Leonard has a good degree in, it's either astrophysics or cosmology. And we went out to lunch a lot, and I'd ask him stuff like, what's the difference between a gamma ray and an X-ray? And, he could tell me. Really good explainer. And just a nice guy. Some people are kind of put off a little bit, but I never was. The Trammells in general were very good to me. They helped any way they could. And, I'm so grateful. I feel like I'm within a web of people that have done favors for each other. We all know each other. We get together each fall for a conference, which is called the Hackers Conference, but it's the old-time meaning of hacker, which is the system wizard that will solve your problems for you.
Right.
Information likes to be free. It is almost like it has a life of its own. And these products never stop. Dave, do you have an Integrator board still? Then a guy got on LinkedIn Professional just so he could email me. And I didn't know my email was that hard to get. I posted it on, the Atari pages.
Mm-hmm.
He has a 68030 SST accelerator from Gadgets, and it's not working right with his machine. Do I have any ideas? Yeah. It's just that I haven't worked on that since 1992.
Right.
Well, can you do what you could? I went to my SciQuest cartridges, 44 megabyte SciQuest. Man, that was hot hardware for the day. And I kludged up a SciQuest drive for the PC and plugged them in. And out of 12 cartridges, 10 were fully readable.
Wow.
I know. Let's see, 92 to 8 would be 8 years plus 14 is 22 years old.
Yeah.
I mean, SciQuest is no more, but good grief. I ended up emailing him the source code to the SST so he could look for problems in there.
Wow.
And we went up, down, and around, and he said, why don't I just send you my ST and your accelerator board and see if you can figure out what's wrong. So part of cleaning up was laying out his Mega ST and plugging a 68030 into it. It just doesn't stop.
Yeah, it's amazing. People are still into it. So that gets into what was going to be my question was, so you said you cleaned up recently, you found all sorts of stuff around your place. Did you find any 8-bit stuff that the world needs that's unpublished that anything at all that we can share?
I didn't trip over anything. That being said, a lot of the computer gear was put into boxes marked miscellaneous. I came across some Integrator boards, 2 of them, and one SST that was at the bottom of, God knows how it got there box. But not anything right off. One thing is when you divorce, it's time to simplify your life.
Sure.
And we had a 2-car size storage unit, and I went and cleaned it out. And it was kind of throwaway stuff by the box load because it was taking 2 days to just go through it.
Yeah.
And, this was about 1998 probably. Here I am throwing away a laser writer, an Atari laser writer. Now that is a great experience to have.
Why is that?
Well, just this laser writer and I have seen a lot of territory together, and now I get to finally throw it away. So this is happening in January, and I'm standing on a mixture of ice and water and a little bit of gasoline, heaving this stuff into the dumpster.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, the god of gravity decides that gravity should be sideways, not up or down. And now I'm wondering why I'm laying in slush. And I mean, that was cold.
Yeah.
And Eric was with me helping. He ran around the car. He said he heard a big thud. And in the meantime, what you do when you reach my age after you fall is you kind of see what still works. Okay, that works. I have a hand, yeah. But I could not turn my right foot.
Mm-hmm.
And I had done something called a trimalleolar tear. I have a brother that's a doctor, which is the only way I ever learned how to pronounce it. It involves breaking your leg bone and breaking all the tendons in your ankle. The good word for it is it really sucks. And Eric had had his driver's license for 3 days.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, Eric, would you mind driving me to the hospital? I think I've broken my leg. So he helps me to the car. And the expression in his eyes, he has the, I'm going to drive look that kids at age 16 get.
Right.
And he's thinking of hospitals, maybe one up in Great Falls, Montana, just for a good long drive. But he was truly on his game that day. There was a hospital, 4 or 5 blocks north. He even went in and badgered the ER people to bring out a gurney for me because I was not walking. And interesting things happen around Atari equipment. I, had a broken leg, and, that was tedious and not very interesting and really a pain. But interesting things happen. I was so proud of Eric. We did the manuals I did the one for Magic Sack, and I did the one for Spectre 128, and then we did the Spectre GCR, and that was a huge leap in manuals. Every other chapter was a story, barely involving computers. And I thought, people don't read computer manuals because they suck.
Right.
But if I give them a manual that's readable, maybe they'll read it. And they did. We had a total of 4 RTFM moments with customers where they hadn't read the blankety-blank manual. We had 4 people who had to exchange it because it didn't work with a graphics card that was popular. And that's it. I read the warranty cards, and I was always fascinated. People would tell me what they were doing with their Spectre. Everything from teaching language to Eskimos. There were 4 customers in Iran. I have no idea what's happened with them. But I tell the Neil Young story there. I tell the story of what happened to the Seagate 225 that lost me a month of work. Basically, I took it out and shot it.
I think we've all wanted to do that once or twice to do a drive.
Everybody should be able to do that once or twice. In Las Vegas during the Comdex shows, which are no more, but during them, there were 2 places in town where you could rent a machine gun and bring your computer stuff in. And there was a big line at them. I thought that was so funny.
Nice.
And in Spectre, the manual became very personal. I argued with the editor. It's all right there in print, Right. Dave, you didn't mean that word. Try this word. Oh, for God's sakes, editor, And I told stories. And the 68030 SST manual, I think, was the best of all of them. At the end, it tells the story of Eric, who was at a famous person's tea, which is a school thing, where each kid has to find a character in history, dress like them, and give a speech on, what they did.
Right.
Jennifer did Joan of Arc, and it really kind of fitted her. Idealist, strong, I'm finding the wrong words here. I had driven down to Colorado Springs to find out where the Nikola Tesla laboratory was. Well, it's now the Deaf and Blind Institute that helps people. And there's a sign across the street saying, Nikola Tesla's Colorado Springs lab. So Eric asks me about Nikola Tesla. And he always says I answer too much. But he decided he wanted to be Nikola Tesla for the famous person's tea.
Okay.
So up he gets, and he has a tux on. And someone behind me says, "My God, he's handsome." Honest, I didn't know that person. And Eric starts off with, "I'm Nikola Tesla. I gave the world electricity." And it was one of the finest moments of my life to watch him. And he talked about what Tesla had done and so forth. And as I was writing this for the manual, I had tears in my eyes. So I noted that as well. Every reviewer of that product says, you've got to read the manual, especially the part about Nikola Tesla. And 3 people, their graphics card still would not work with the SST. And they all said, "But could I keep the manual?" Can I trade it in and keep the manual? Well, yes. One of them told me he keeps the GCR manual around just to show a good manual does exist somewhere.
Awesome. Nice.
My advice is probably skewed by all my experiences.
Of course.
Pardon?
I said, of course.
Yeah. And all of the wonderful people who've helped me. I feel like I should be mentioning more names because I'm so grateful for them. John Ridges helped my mom out not that long ago and restored this record from 1941 where she sang, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And it was all dinged up, and John was now doing studio-level quality CDs and engineering them. So he turned some of his tools loose and cleaned the recording right up. And my mom was so grateful. It's the first time I got to hear her singing professionally.
Wow.
What great people. There have been maybe a few people I didn't care for over the years. But it's like writing a review of bad software. I could do that, but there's so much good software that I could be telling people about.
Right.
So I pretty much always went with that. If you want to write, here's a piece of advice that was given to me. Every day, write 1 page. Even if you're working 9 to 5, there's time each day for 1 page. And in a year, you'll have a novel. Jerry Pornell taught me that. And Robert Heinlein told Jerry that. And Jerry says, he gave me a lot of publicity when we were starting out. And I asked him how I could thank him. And he says, you can't. You have to pass it forward. Do what I did for other people. And that was the first time I heard pass it forward. I guess they made a movie out of it later.
Yeah.
But information likes to be free. Someone at Control Data sent me the source code to their terminal so I could write my Plato stuff. I'm not sure who, but they heard that somebody was needing this. Go with gut instinct. Your brain is smarter than you think, and the subconscious is always in there sorting things around and coming up with ideas. And just because some old guy says it's impossible, that doesn't mean it really is. I did stuff that Motorola says is not possible with their 68,000 chip.
Mm-hmm.
And when I showed it to a Motorola guy, he said, this is unbelievable. Because we came out with the 68010 chip just to do what you did here on the 68,000.
Nice. Wow.
And it's fun working with the person you're married to, but there are limits to it. It's good to have some distance between you and the office. It lets you mentally switch from programmer mode to husband mode.
Right.
Between the kids and me and the business and everything, oh man, we really really had a pretty good 15 years there. I've heard a lot of people tell me that 15 years is pretty good these days, regardless.
Yeah.
She's now an excellent programmer, and every now and then she gets the, "Are you the Sandy Small of David and Sandy Small?" Yep, I am. The kids these days are all grown up. I mean, we had James in we called it a baby jail at some of the shows.
Mm-hmm.
And people would come by as I'm busy changing a diaper. Hi. Hi, just a minute.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean,
that's awesome.
It was pretty cool. Be open to using new tools, because every now and then a tool shows up that makes life a lot easier and makes things possible. Getting a Zax in-circuit emulator from Jim Allen of Fastech saved my sanity when I was doing Spectre 3.0. With it, when you crashed, it had saved up the last 256 instructions before the crash. And instead of having to guess and say, well, go and try to stop here, or here, or here, and see if it makes it that far, especially hard to do when the ROMs have the code, and ROMs aren't alterable. But as Zax, it was just click, clack, done. And when people do things like that, they've enabled me to do things back. The expression, standing on the shoulders of giants, comes to mind. J Minor, the whole good programming team at Atari, how well I was treated by Atari, both 8-bit and ST. My mentors who showed me how to live, how to be interested in things. Maybe best advice is from Ted Taylor. He was the absolute best nuclear weapon designer in Los Alamos. But that was the first part of his life. And after that, he became very concerned about plutonium, if it would be stolen, and so forth. And he's the guy who publicized those worries. John McPhee and Ted Taylor wrote a book about it. Ted Taylor said, if I'm not interested in something, I'm not sure I can really learn it. And I thought, boy, that hits home. I mean, you know, high school English was not my favorite class. You could watch the second hand going tick, and you could have a complete thought go through your mind, tick, before the next tick.
Right.
Talk about slow. I learned how not to write there. Really.
Yeah.
You know, the English teachers appear to have 5 or 6 really depressing books that they have their students read. Lord Jim. What's the one where only the kids survive a plane crash and they're washed up on... Pardon?
Lord of the Flies.
Yes. Mr. Jack Kerouac wrote a novel in 4 days, dropping speed the whole time. And it's a classic? I don't think so. It reads like somebody who can't remember the beginning of the novel. And the one about the kid who goes up to Alaska and dies. Made a movie out of that one.
Yeah.
So when I was reviewing these books, doing book reports for the teacher, I would write, well, this was an interesting story. The characters were well-rounded, the pat phrases that are used.
Right.
And then I would write, what's the rat's name? Old movie, A Boy and His Rat, are close, and the rat sets about getting revenge when the boy is hurt. Willard.
Okay.
So I'd write Willard. Well, teacher, actually, Dave Small is lying here. He didn't like the book. He thought it sucked. And the character development? Give me a break. It was only 2 paragraphs. And on and on. And he would argue with me. Willard and I arguing back and forth in these papers. And boy, the English teacher was glad when graduation came around. She wrote in my yearbook, may you and Willard please, I had an interesting experience with you. Which is her way of saying, damn it.
Yeah. Thanks. All right.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate your time so much. On that note, I should wrap this up.
Well, if you have any other questions that pop up, or if something turns out to be illegible, in effect, well, really, give me a call or drop me an email.
I shall. Thank you. And I really appreciate your time, and this has been fascinating.
I appreciate what you're doing. People that are far-sighted enough to remember important stuff tend to be pretty special people. I've noticed that there's a difference between pack rats and people who are assembling a collection. If I was going to do more hardware, I'd hire a guy who had been trained in analog electronics, because they know all the stuff like impedance and signal ringing, bounce, why we take a whole layer to put +5 on, all that stuff. And when I can, I try to help people figure things out. It's just a happy way to live. You keep on doing what you're doing.
All right. Thank you,
Very
sir.
cool. Oh, sure been fun talking.
It has been. Thank you very much.
You bet.